All right, I guess. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Watershed Congress. This is our second day of the virtual Watershed Congress of the week. And we are happy that you are joining us here today. The Watershed Congress is organized by the Delaware River Keeper Network in collaboration with many organizations, one of which is the Montgomery County Community College from where I belong. And my name is Caesar, and I will be your moderator. Our presenters for today will be Jennifer Hahn, Xavier Care, Sarah Chudnovsky, and Tony Velas. Jennifer has been involved in civic engagement and activism in Redding and Berks County. Appending Racism encourages dialogue between individuals and groups on a broad range of racism and racial justice topics, and seeks to find unifying and racially just solutions to end systemic racism. And so, without further ado, let me turn over the forum to Jennifer.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Caesar. I'd like to start, before we begin, with a land acknowledgement. Where I stand, I acknowledge the Lenni Lenape and all other original land ownership in Pennsylvania. The Susquehannock, Shawnee, Iroquois, Munsee, Delaware, and Erie, the original stewards and owners. We acknowledge also all peoples who were original stewards wherever each one of us tonight is gathered and are standing. And because our group has always been based on justice as well as healing, I'd like us all to take a deep breath in and out. Just a couple, we'll do them all together. So breathe in, breathe out. Make sure your feet are on the ground. Breathe in, breathe out. One more time, breathe in and out. We're here together. Please think of your own roots and your own struggles and breathe. Thank you. And I'd like the first slide, please. While we're doing that, I want to thank the Delaware River Keepers Network Congress. You have done a lot of work to make this event possible, and we are grateful to be and honored to be asked to be here this evening. I also want to call out all the racial justice work that's done by so many of the groups, both beginning justice work and already well underway, such as the work in Wilmington, Chester, and Camden, for example. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about upending racism, the who, why, what this is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with our group, just to know that it's a group that's based on healing and on authenticity, learning to work with difficult questions, and trying to develop resiliency and connectedness within our community. There's a common urgency to reshape communities and ourselves. The urgency is racial justice, and the means is ourselves, starting with ourselves and moving outward into our families, friends, and communities and groups. And the goal is to move to systemic change. Could I have the next slide, please? What we'll cover, it's humanity which must rebuild a livable planet by agreement. It's humans who must agree to this change. And I hope we'll present the case for expanding the definition of sustainability to include ending racism for the sake of humanity. And tonight, the people that are gathered here to talk to you represent from Redding, Pennsylvania, many groups. um, many parts of the communities. The South of Penn Taskforce, Barrio Alegria, Sunrise Berks, Shutdown Berks Coalition, land reparations work, Reading for 100, which is an energy sustainability effort. And there are many, many more groups in our community, and we're trying to work together. We're trying to work together effectively. I also want to note that at the end of this seminar, we will have resources available to the participants. So please look for those, some resources about these groups, as well as things that you can do in your own communities. If I could have the next slide, please. I want you to take a good look at this map and ask yourselves, just amongst yourself, of all the boundaries that you see, which is the boundary that stands out most for you, the one that you recognized first? And if you're like me, the first boundary that you recognized was the state of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But I want you to imagine the layer of time and the fact that there were many other civilizations, many other boundaries, and many other uses for this land. So when we start to think of our relationships with soil and water, what does being in relationship with the land and water mean? And what about the battles for survival and endangered life? Reflect on the fight against extinction of the ecosystems and extinction of cultures. Both follow similar patterns. And reflect on property and land and whose ownership is it really? And where does the story of stewardship begin? Next slide, please. I'd like to talk about the state of diversity. When I was researching for this talk, I thought, okay, I don't like to quote statistics, but maybe I should get a picture of statistics about diversity. And I found that a broad study was done in 2014 that found that Black, Indigenous, people of color, which I'm going to refer to as BIPOC from here on in to make it shorter, in conservation groups and preservation groups, in governmental agencies, and in the environmental grant-making foundations that were studied in this broad study. Among the staff positions in these groups, the entire non-white population was between 12 and 15.5%. And then when we look at the leadership positions, the people sitting on boards, the CEOs, the directors, that number drops, that percentage drops to from 13% to as low as 4.6%. Obviously, there is something wrong with that diversity. And I want to propose that the fight for equity is intersectional with the need for the environmental crisis. Next slide, please. Okay. So a while ago, I did another talk on equity, and I thought, how can I talk about the overtaking of things? What can I show visually? So I thought about endangered species or threatened species, threatened sometimes by foreign plant species, moving into places where they did not evolve. And so trees that grow into a place where they do not evolve do not suffer damage from insects or fungi or viruses, for example. And they can take up the soil and change the pH and overtake the area. And what happens when that is the case is that we end up creating a monoculture. So the extinction that would cause diversity in a situation like that is lack of nutrients, barriers, such as to sun and soil and water. And this is an analogy to the extinction of cultures. with the barriers being life resources such as access to health care, food, shelter, and many things. Unchecked, the forest becomes a monoculture, and unchecked in our culture, diversity dies. Next slide, please. In my group, we often study different subjects, whatever seems to be the right thing at the time, what people are interested in, what's happening in our community. But I framed it based on a book, some ideas that I got from a book by Stacey Abrams called Lead from the Outside. And she asks 3 problems with most of the work she's done. Very simple. What is the problem? Why is it important? And how do we fix it? And even then, what can we do together? Even if we can't agree on everything, what can we find to do together? I think it's important, these questions are important because what we happen to do in our society oftentimes is take it from what is the problem, and then we rush into what can we do to fix it? And I think it's important to step back and realize that all of us, especially those with tons of privilege like I have, that it's important to figure out the why. It's important to understand the history, the context, the community, and the factors that go into a problem before we try to solve it. And when we work together, finding those common threads about what we can do together. So the real transformational work we end up doing is very personal. But this work must leverage change within our environment to end systemic racism in our communities, or it has very little value. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to jump into some basic definitions. I'm going to take a sip of water. Because we've heard all these definitions, we've heard all these things in the news, and I think we just have to jump into these and try to understand them, and it'll give us some foundation for the rest of our presentation. Systemic racism is rooted in a racist foundation. Think genocide and slavery, the foundation of our country. Systemic racism today is composed of intersecting and overlapping racist institutions, policies, behaviors, practices that give an unjust amount of resources and power and rights to people who are white while denying them to people of color. Next slide. Underneath the context of systemic racism is another definition that I really need to lay out for us tonight, and that is white supremacy culture. This is such a word that has, I think, caused discomfort for some of us, and I just want to take the time to explain what I mean by the differences. White supremacy culture does not mean white supremacy. I want you to think about a petri dish. Think about a kind of area where it's the belief of ideas that flow back and forth, the thoughts and actions that originally were established by colonizing powers and then simply moved into the industrial age, moved into the technical age, and here we are today. The ways that we think are based on tradition, and they're based on practice. And we feel that they're superior. We believe that. We believe these things, and we believe they're settled best practice. And therefore, the culture that's dominant is able to maintain a system as part of an overarching experience system. Unfortunately, when certain aspects of our traditions are held up, unfortunately, many other things get laid down, and the ideas, thoughts, and beliefs and actions. Could we go back? Back, there we go. The beliefs, thoughts, and actions of non-dominant cultures and races then therefore have to be less valid and less trusted. We are all affected by white supremacy culture, every one of us. Okay, now we can move to the next slide. Thank you. And I just want to conclude on these definitions with why this is important. Remember the why. These are the consequences. The negative outcomes of systemic racism are real, resulting in health outcomes for people of color, BIPOC, people of color. The lifespan of many people are shortened. There are huge wealth disparities that are still lingering as a result of our history of slavery and discrimination. And there are access disparities in many, many communities to food, to housing, and to education. We're all affected by a system that privileges some and disadvantages others. Think about that. And finally, decision-making is real power and must be shared. Solutions come from all stakeholders. When we think about building an organization and solving problems, it's all the communities together that bring together the real power for change. And finally, a status quo which degrades the environment, meaning systemic racism and the engine that puts all this together, continues to degrade the environment, and human life is not sustainable. So again, I hope that this helps clarify why I think that racism is such an important aspect of environmental justice. And finally, the last slide. I think there's one more slide for me. Yes, okay. And I just want to take a little look at the history that came after Indigenous peoples. And when we were in the late 1900s and early 20th century, beginning to put together a sense of we need to save some of this land and not develop everything. The people that did it felt oftentimes very entitled. Remember, we grew up in a colonized society. For example, John Muir wrote in his essay in 1901, I'm just quoting one little part of it, as to Indians, most of them are dead or civilized into useless innocence. To me, the sadness of that is that what wisdom has been lost as we extinguished the indigenous cultures. What has been lost? John Muir did not care much for indigenous peoples. I believe there was a sense, and it ties into eugenics of the time, is that there was somehow a superior race that we could sort of try to continue and build and make. Unfortunately, a lot of the early environmentalists were also proponents of eugenics. So this is where we're coming from, but we are not going this way. And so with this, I'd like to turn this over, and with Xavier and I'd like to introduce Xavier, and we're going to move into the next section of our talk. You can put that down, Xavier. Stop the screen sharing. There we go. All right. So we're going to move into talking a little bit more about racism. That's kind of, I guess you could say that's Xavier's main part of his talk. I just want to introduce Xavier. Over the years that I've known him, he's influenced discussion and advancement of environmental issues in our community, as well as social justice issues. He's a member of Sunrise Berks, which Green New Deal is one thing that there is a proponent, and Reading for 100. He's done a lot of work in our community in many ways. He's a great thinker. Hello, Xavier.
Hi, thanks so much, Jen. Thanks for everybody here with us today. Thanks for everybody that's been listening to us so far. I want to open up just by saying thank you to Jennifer. And I have something specific I want to say in that thank you. Thank you for doing so much work to support me through this labor and for making accommodations for my comfort. I genuinely appreciate it. I feel confident that we'll be able to help someone put the intersectionalities of race and environmentalism into a new context. And I recognize that my brain doesn't work like every single individual who's listening to us today. And many of these points are my opinion, but pulled from my lived experiences. As a mixed race man with ADD and anxiety, and who often passes for attractive, I know that this world isn't made for me and it's not made for you, but I am trying to thrive and strive for better and use my privileges to uplift the inequalities and transcend generations of trauma and pain, and will continue to upend our racist systems. So thank you again, Jen. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to have this audience.
Thank you. Well, let's have a conversation about all these thoughts that I think are so important. You've used the term de-individualism. This is important. I mean, looking at a person not as a full-fledged person, but narrowly as someone who represents culture, it's dehumanizing and confining. What stories bring the unconvinced closer to an understanding of the harm that racism can cause and the need to dismantle this system?
Thank you for that. Question one. I think that the answer to that is that there is no perfect way to help people understand the waters of racism that we swim in, but I think it's important to remember this. Capitalism has forced our earth into mass manufacturing products and ideas that are sold to us through social media and advertisements. And the only way to upend that system is to recognize our intersectionalities as individuals and accommodate with people's individual needs. If I could share a little story, is that okay?
Oh, yeah.
So one thing I've held close to my heart is when I'm making friends. I think about how does this person that I want to be friends with treat strangers, especially people who work in systems as subservient. People who work in fast food, people who work in retail, those are the people who we often expect to come up to us and say, "Excuse me, how can I help you?" And I want everybody here to think about those dynamics. What do you do when you're in power? And do you then respect that person and their humanity? So I want to then ask, do you value who they are as they spend their genuine time with you? Despite the menial pay and the inconsistent health benefits that capitalism says is enough to compensate these individuals for their labor, you're standing directly in front of them. And you have to consider whether or not you respect that person who's standing directly in front of you. That person who's on the other side of that phone, helping you through tech support, that person who is helping you design a great outfit. All of these people are human, and all of them have humanity, and we need to show each one of them and each one of us compassion. All right, if you want to go to the next question, I'm ready.
I will. I want to dig a little deeper into systemic oppression and racism. And there is a key definition, anti-Blackness. Should we tackle that? And how does it manage to persist today?
Thanks. I'll start with the definition of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is the hatred of Blacks, as put into this definition. The hatred of Black people was enabled with the slavery of African Americans and normalized hatred and oppression. Today, it manifests as systemic oppression, as Jennifer talked about earlier in depth, and it still manifests as systemic white supremacy. Anti-Blackness is also the personal, cultural, social, legal, and structural attacks on people of color, people who are Black and people who are brown.
Thanks. How can we reimagine power structure? We've talked about this oppression and how damaging it is, but how can we reimagine power and recenter power?
Okay, first, again, I want to say that this is a personal question and a systemic question. Everyone is touched by systemic racism and oppression, but before newly engaged individuals can tackle these ideas and these systems, they must first prepare their open minds with hope, rather prepare them for hope and prepare them for despair. Both of these require focus, introspection, and support systems. Now, with that said, folks who are often asked about the problems in spaces like this and asked for the solutions are people of color. The biggest thing many people of color are lacking is that support system. And again, it's an intentional effect of white supremacy, which has deprioritized our communities' educations. It's a system that has jailed our parents, left many of us homeless, in debt, and bearing the brunt of many life-threatening health conditions, and the list goes on. This acknowledgement is first and pivotal to reforming and removing the barriers for our communities and other oppressed intersectional communities so that all of us can thrive.
I think we have time for one or two questions. Xavier, would you like to do the tokenism? Do you want to talk about tokenism? Or
Actually, if we're short on time, can we talk about there's this near the bottom question, just before reparations. I want to speak about individual and collective identity.
all right. What is individual and collective identity?
Well, we all have truths that we carry with us, truths that our parents had taught us, and truths that were not taught to us, and truths that would help us to be much more confident in ourselves and imagine better futures for ourselves in our country and in our lives and in our relationships. And I think that it's important to recognize that as individuals, we are losing big parts of our histories because white supremacy culture is actively prioritizing itself over you and your identities. So I think that individual and collective identity is essential to Americans' futures and America's future. So right now, America's identity and our systems are founded in that white supremacy and has systemically disconnected individuals like me from our roots and from our identities and from our senses of self. And I believe that our future depends on America, on an America that is capable of supporting and inspiring individual hopes, inspiring individual recognition, and inspiring individual compensation. And I also recognize that capitalism is more synonymous with America than democracy. And that's obvious to many of us. And it leaves so many people of color and many other groups of people feeling that they are not represented, and often, very, very often, feeling tokenized and devalued.
Mhm.
And that's the last of it before we go to reparations. Are you ready, Jen?
I'm ready. Would you like to talk about reparations in the context of education and housing and healthcare and mental health?
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to say first that that reparations often starts in the idea that we must return the capital that was created by the slaves being used as laborers, and to compensate for the systemic and individual and collective harm that has been perpetuated. And now we as a society need to uplift the individuals through long-term sustained education with comprehensive support inside and outside of our schools. And we need to uplift folks from poverty and enable ownership of homes like Tony Velos will expand on more further in the presentation. And we need to enable ownership of land like Sarah is gonna be talking about very soon. And we need to remove the financial and social barriers that stop people from seeking out help, whether that be help for finances, whether that be help for their mental health. And and so many other things. There are so many barriers financially and socially that stop people of color from joining these conversations. So now I want to enable Sarah to continue this conversation about reparations. Thanks for this
Thank
section,
you,
Jen.
Xavier. Thank you so much.
Before I pass it off, I want to say Sarah is a longtime friend of mine, and Sarah is one of the most kind, genuine people that I've met in so freaking long. Crazy intelligent, and I'm so grateful that I get to pass it off to you. And I know that you'll be sharing at least some of the most important information that I've heard in a long time. So Sarah Chavnosky, are you ready to go next?
Yeah, thanks Xavier, and thanks Jen and Xavier for everything you've shared so far, and yeah, for all of you for being here. So before you put up the slideshow, I can just kind of say that I am calling in from Reading, and I'm outside, so hopefully I don't have like too many trains or motorcycles going by, but I'm in Reading, and I know this is my third year getting to be at the Watershed Congress, and it's so special that we can still like do this and gather even virtually, and I'm really grateful to get to be a part of a community that Watershed wide is committed to each other that way. And I know a lot of people here from my work in the nonprofit world with conservation in Berks County, and just really special experiences on the Sojourn with the Watershed Stewards, and just really grateful to get to do that work day in and day out here in Berks County. But today I'm going to share about some work outside of that work that I've been working on with Xavier at Sunrise, and also with another group focused on like movement work or social movement work. And so the two projects I'm going to talk about are the Shutdown Berks Coalition, which is fighting to close the Berks County Detention Center here in Leesport, PA, and also my work as a reparations accomplice with the Black Land and Power Project. And so I'm going to share about both of those projects in the context of my own story, trying to think about how to be in right relationship to the Susquehanna River. So yeah, Xavier, you can put up the slides.
Alrighty, I'll pass it up with the slides right now. Just one moment.
And yeah, so as you're doing that, I want us to take a second to again ground in our values and in the people and places we care about, which is something that we really emphasize at Sunrise. And I won't spend too much time explaining what Sunrise Berks is. You can actually just Google. There's a ton of media coverage since 2017 about the Sunrise movement, but it's local climate, young people doing climate activism work. And here in Berks County, we focused on the detention center, but we want to ground in the people and places we care about, and also in our values. And I know that talking about race and talking about class can divide us. A lot of fear comes up, fear for some people of harm, and fear for safety, and fear for losing dignity, and then fear of committing harm, fear of being offensive. And so I want to just name those aspects of what Jen called white supremacy culture. And I think about white supremacy culture as some of the conditions that allow harm to continue to perpetuate. And I'm going to keep talking about that. And some of those are this fear of disposability, that if we make a mistake or commit harm, like we're out. And fear of perfection, like a dynamic of perfectionism, avoiding conflict and tension. And I just want to reshift those into the ways that conflict and tension and agitation can be generative when we're committed to being with each other and not to disposing each other, and to allowing for mistakes. And so I also, would invite that from anyone watching this to chime in later. And so as we ground in our values, I want to, oh, sorry, do you have the slides, Xavier? So I'm thinking about this work from that lens of transformative justice. So there's restorative justice that seeks to get things back to the way they were before a harm was committed and make repair restitution, but that just continues the conditions that created the harm in the first place. And so we want to actually transform those patterns around us. And to start that off, I want to just name some values that I'm bringing to the space are the valuing interdependence and self-determination. And I'd like to invite everyone watching to take a second and name one, or think to yourself of one value that is integral to why you do this work. I know why you work so hard for our water and our land and our communities. And think about that value. And I'd also like to invite you to then think about a place where you connect to those values deeply. For me, this is a picture of the Susquehanna River. And I know we're in the Delaware River watershed. It's all connected in my mind. But I also want to hold space for people who are separated from those places that they value, or like whether that's from migration or incarceration, fire, industry, development, climate change, or for people whose connection to a place has changed because of a hard thing like grief or losing someone you care about that you connected with at that river spot or hiking spot or your garden or a mountain or your backyard or just the flower pot you have on your desk, whatever it may be. And so yeah, I invite you to think about a value you hold and to think about one of those places. And so yeah, for me, when I think about interdependence, I think of the Susquehanna River, which I've been doing an annual canoe trip on the past 2 summers, just for the first weekend of August after my birthday. And this summer, I thought that it might be canceled from the pandemic, but fortunately, we still got to go, and just a smaller group. Thanks, Jen. And we paddled on these islands for 3 days, and the ability to disconnect after such a really hard year was so restorative and so beautiful. And one of the days I spent, we had a family of 3 bald eagles just kind of leapfrogging us for the entire day. There were 3 fledgling bald eagles, and we paddled right under their nests, and just the ability to be surrounded by, I know bald eagles are almost cheesy because they're this like icon, but to know that they were nearly extinct and are still there and thriving was so deeply meaningful. And I spent some time asking myself, like, what does it mean for me to relate to the Susquehanna River in right relationship? There's my own work in conservation, but also thinking about a longer historical perspective. I researched the history of where I had paddled, which is the section near Wyalusing, PA, north of Wilkes-Barre, which I think a lot of people know about the LNG facilities in Wyalusing, which I'm not going to focus on, but also something to look up later, and which the Delaware River Network is doing a lot of work on. And I found out about the Sullivan expedition from 1779. And I learned when I got off this river trip, like the same day, that in 1779, Revolutionary War soldiers paddled up the same exact stretch of river I had just done, and they were they were seeking to destroy the Haudenosaunee Nation. And sometimes the way the Revolutionary War is fought, it just didn't learn about the indigenous history that went along with it. And so there's a lot more about that I won't go into with the Revolutionary War itself. But this campaign was a campaign of genocide. And I then learned that my ancestors in Berks County, they came to Berks County in the 1730s as Pennsylvania Dutch settlers. Some of them were, and many other Berks County settlers were actively involved in this campaign, and they paddled upriver, burning village after village after village. Over 40 Haudenosaunee villages were burned over the course of this campaign, which happened this exact time of year, late summer, early fall, when it was time for harvest and time for so the growth that had been happening all summer to be like stored for the winter. And so a lot of Haudenosaunee people had fled and were not killed during those village burnings, but they lost their source for the winter for food, and many starved and lost their land at that time. And to think about my relationship to this river, like I can think about my life, but there's also that piece of history that I couldn't that I have to also account for. And I just thinking about the level of atrocity and the of harm, like what did my ancestors have to do to themselves? Like what did they have to not listen to be able to commit that kind of a harm and that kind of violence? And that's the question that I want to think about for why, like how white supremacy is also harmful to white people, and how we harm ourselves in holding up these systems because we don't challenge them. And so that so-called campaign served to expand the scale of colonial settlement, and further settlement rested on that foundation of violence and harm. And that was I think about that line of the people going up the river as creating a border, and thinking about the ways that boundaries and borders are created by people and can be violently upheld like that. And so when thinking about that and how my ancestors helped create that border, I got involved to shut down Berks, thinking about the ways that today we still maintain these violent borders, and what that infrastructure looks like today in 2020 is the Berks Detention Center. And so you can go to the next slide. And thanks, Jen, for the time. So the Shutdown Berks Coalition is a group of community activists and organizations from across Pennsylvania, but also including like national immigrants' rights organizations and lawyers. There's an interfaith witness group. There's teams of doctors and nurses who are involved. And it's a lot of people that collectively for like at least 5 or 6 years now have been fighting to shut down the Berks Family Detention Center, which is located in Leesport, PA. And the Berks Detention Center is the country's only publicly run ICE detention center. So ICE is US Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. And people seeking asylum legally at the border are arrested and sent to Berks County to await their court proceedings. And this didn't used to be the case. People have the legal right internationally to seek asylum, and they used to be put in the community to wait to go through that legal process. And in the past couple years, has been escalated. And thanks, Jen. And so we have been fighting to shut this down, and a lot of people are fleeing climate disaster. And wait, how many minutes? Sorry, Jen. Can you give me a heads up?
Do you want to, I was wondering if you wanted to also cover the reparations work that you're doing?
Yeah, should I just go for like 2 minutes or a little bit less?
Yeah, I would give that a little bit of time. I just want to make sure we have time for Tony too.
Yeah, I don't want to go over time. So yeah, thanks for bearing with me.
That's okay. That's okay. This is all really good. It's wonderful, Sarah.
Yeah, can you just text me like a 2-minute warning? So the Berks Detention Center is continuing to operate here in Berks County, and I think that on one hand, as organizations working for land and water, if we're not calling out the same violence that's being committed on land for people seeking fleeing climate disaster or political crises that are also fueled by climate disaster, we aren't living in true integrity. And so things people can do who are watching this to get involved to shut down Berks is we just are releasing a documentary. You can host a screening for you or your group or your family, and you can email me for more information, or it's also in the Resource Center. A lot of this campaign is focused on either Governor Wolf, who has the power to release the families with an emergency removal order, or in Berks County, our local county commissioners who are the ones that hold the agreement with ICE that continues this operation. And again, all the detention centers along the southern border are privately owned or run by ICE, and this one is public. So as citizens, our taxpayer dollars are involved here, and we can end this. So that's one way of making repair. And then the other one is the Black Land and Power Network. And I will just really briefly spend 1 minute on this. And I won't show this video, but it is included in the resource section. And I just want to introduce this idea of reparations to build off of what Xavier said, that is, again, about changing the conditions that continue to create harm. And I think that a lot of white people, when they first hear reparations, are just thrown off thinking about this on an individual scale. Like the idea of individually repaying what was lost just feels impossible because it is. And in addition to moving the wealth that we hold that was that comes from slavery or comes from hundreds of years of that violence, we need to be reinvesting in the alternatives and into the futures. And so the Black Land and Power Network is a group that is doing that work. And I've spent the past year with them as a reparations accomplice. And so Black Land and Power is over 100 Black organizations and land spaces. It includes 7 networks and 7,000 acres around the country of land that is owned and stewarded by various Black cooperatives and community groups. And so this work we had just finished this campaign for Reparations Summer to organize resources, money for these, some of these land sites around the country. And we're inviting people with access to wealth to release that wealth that doesn't really belong to us and move it back into the commons, into this network of Black land movement people that are going to build the future. And I think for our groups with conservation and watershed groups, we often are falling into this deep sense of scarcity, not having enough money, not having enough funding. And I want to think about where that comes from and why don't we have money? Who are we not challenging who has the money? And how can we join with movement to support those calls to release the money that is out there? Thanks, Xavier. And there's thinking about too, where, even if we don't have money or wealth ourselves that we perceive, what about the endowments of our organizations? How is that perpetuating harm itself? And how do we move away from that? And so I'll just leave with this quote by Aquia Deirdre Smith, one of the facilitators of Black Land and Power, where she says, we're not asking people to answer for their ancestors' crime. They're asking them to stop upholding the structures that our ancestors created. We're demanding that they stop hoarding the wealth and resources that belong to us all and return the accumulated wealth from our ancestors' labor. So I really invite you to reach out to me, check out the website itself, which is incredibly beautiful, and I will turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, thank you, Jennifer and Xavier, for those presentations. I feel like you really set up a nice background for what I'll be talking about. And I also wanted to thank the Delaware Riverkeeper Network for inviting us all here to speak tonight. I really appreciate the platform. So in the first conversations that I had with the rest of the panelists here on environmental racism in our community, one question came up that kind of stuck in my mind, and I decided to explore that a little further in my own presentation tonight. And that's the question of why there aren't more minorities involved in the environmental movement. So I want to talk a bit about the concept of issues of survival and issues of ownership in our community and how those affect minority involvement in the environmental movement, how we can empower these communities to feel that they can in the outcomes of environmental issues, and how we can address empowerment through the Barrio model of engagement. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be looking at these questions through the Barrio Alegria and South of Penn model of community engagement, empowerment, and transformation. Next slide. So some of the issues that we see in our community, survival issues, have to do with environmental issues and economic issues, kind of a combination of both, as two major pillars among others. From your environmental issues, you have things that arise from pollution and contamination that cause health disparities and resource destruction, such as respiratory issues in children and other health issues later in adults. On the resource side, you see things like unsafe drinking water. But you also have economic issues that we see in our community, things that arise from insufficient minimum wage, job insecurity, stagnating real wages since about the 70s and 80s. And those issues then lead to further complications like the need to work multiple jobs and shifts, and the need for all or most adults in a household to unfortunately have to work in order to support the family. And these are issues that affect, people across the entire population of the U.S., but they're extremely endemic in minority communities. And so these economic and environmental issues also lead to the unfortunate lack of resource accessibility in our communities due to these economic and environmental stressors, things that come from lack of access to clean air and water from pollution and contamination, lack of access to space, which leads to dense housing, lack of access to nature. Green spaces are typically afforded to higher income neighborhoods, even when projects for green spaces are intended for lower income neighborhoods. And then you also have, because of the economic stressors, food scarcity and also lack of access to time. And this is extremely important when it comes to asking why you don't see more minority involvement in the environmental movement, which requires people's time to volunteer, to become informed, and to go out and try to change these issues that affect them on a daily basis. And so all of these different issues lead to a scarcity mindset in our community. If you could imagine for a second a family in which both parents have to work constantly, different shifts, and they have to worry about childcare for their kids when they need it. They need to worry about, food that they need to put on the table for their kids, different bills, the utilities they have to pay for, heat, electricity. And even now during the pandemic, to complicate things even further, with schools going virtual, now you need access to the internet as well, which not everyone has. Unfortunately, there's also a digital disparity in our community. And so what you see is this reduced mental bandwidth due to scarcity mindset leads to prioritizing these short-term issues as opposed to long-term prioritization or prioritization of long-term issues. So we're always constantly trying to deal with symptoms and not the disease of environmental racism. But in addition to these survival priorities, so can I have the next slide, please? So in addition to these issues of survival priorities, you also have issues of ownership in our community. As some of the other panelists were mentioning, ownership is huge, to have a healthy community. And so due to colonialism, you have a tradition, unfortunately, a legacy that has eroded the concept of ownership in minority communities. You've had the downplaying and stripping of ownership values in the colonized by the colonizers. And then in modern times, you also have neocolonialism, otherwise known as gentrification, in which you may have ownership is burgeoning and becoming more important in minority communities. But unfortunately, as minorities make their communities more attractive and make them places where people want to live once more, aka people with money, those people come in and they essentially recolonize those neighborhoods, gentrify them, and basically price out minorities that then have to leave those neighborhoods they were just beginning to build ownership over. How do we address this? Well, you empower minorities and marginalized communities to feel ownership of their neighborhoods. You address things like transiency, civic engagement, so people are aware of the issues in their community. You organize neighborhoods and you organize people so they can actually start affecting policies that are related to these different issues. Overall, as you address these issues, people become more involved in determining the outcomes of issues like environmental issues. But then you also have, interestingly enough, we have democracy in the public, at least in theory anyway, but in the workplace, we don't have democracy. And a lot of times what you end up seeing is industries where decisions are made by people who don't live in a community. And so in theory, if you would democratize capitalism and democratize the workplace and allow the workers who live locally in that area to make decisions about what that particular factory or industry is doing in that community, then that local control would lead to better local environmental outcomes because the people who live there would want better environment to live in. It would also lead to better economic outcomes for workers, which would alleviate some of the economic issues we explored earlier. So after all of that technical, theory and kind of going into some of the background behind why we see some of the issues in our neighborhood, in our communities, if I could have the next slide, I'll talk about how nonprofits and privileged individuals can appropriately become involved and help to engage and empower minority communities. So I would say one of the best ways to do this is to use the SOP south of Penn or Barrio Alegria model. These are two local nonprofit, well, one is a nonprofit, the other one is a task force. It's a coalition of organizations right here in Southwest Reading. And so it's actually, it's pretty simple when you think about it, but it's super important. So first of all, ask questions, learn about the issues in a community. Don't assume that you know what the issues are. Engage in conversations to learn about what those issues are and what people think about them. Offer tools and resources to communities in order to support them. And likewise, co-organize with the community. The community is your partner. It is not your client or damsel in distress. Allow communities and their members to infiltrate your organization to allow for community representation and ownership of your organization by the community, not the other way around. Your organization should not be looking to superficially infiltrate a community and decide, well, how can we try to interface with the community in that way? Instead, it should be the community infiltrates you and tells you what needs to be done. And cultural competency, meet people where they're at. Understand the norms and culture of a community, learn how to speak their language in order to connect, engage with the community, and recruit culturally competent individuals to advocate on behalf of, educate, and recruit these communities. So I'll give you a little example. I'll leave you with an example here. If I could have the next slide. Oh, never mind. You can go back. There's a picture. It's a nice, wonderful picture. Actually, let's see if I can share my screen here. Xavier, can I share my screen? Go ahead and see if I can share it here. Okay. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. What do you see?
Oh, there you go.
I hope you see bright, beautiful people, right? So this is after one of our cleanups. We do monthly cleanups here in Southwest Reading, the South of Penn Taskforce and Barrio Alegria in partnership. And the way that these came about was when we first started doing our work in Southwest Reading, we went around and we surveyed people in the community, and we asked them, what are the biggest issues that you see in your community? And we expected people to say safety, drugs, crime, that kind of stuff. But surprisingly, no, that wasn't on the top of their list. What was on the top of their list was litter and cleanliness in their neighborhoods. And interestingly enough, if you ask our local public works clean city educator, they will tell you that increased litter usually leads to increased or correlates with increased crime and decreased business investment. So it stands to reason that conversely, that means that decreased litter would lead to decreased crime and increased business investment, which means more economic opportunities for local residents, which again relates back to the economic issues that we were talking about earlier. So we decided, okay, if people want to address litter in their communities, then what we'll start doing is we'll start holding monthly cleanups with the hopes that people will start to take ownerships of these cleanups and make them their own. But unfortunately, at first, the reaction from the community was, that's not my job. I personally don't litter, and it's not my problem. That's the city's job to clean. So we decided to speak to with community members and community leaders in the area who were respected by people in their neighborhoods, and we organized a neighborhood group, and we decided that because there wasn't a whole lot of energy and excitement behind these cleanups, we would build that excitement and that energy around a cleanup competition model instead, because people who don't normally like to volunteer, especially after working multiple shifts all week and everything that we talked about, because we made it fun and we made it family friendly, it attracted a whole lot more community members, and our cleanups actually exploded. We did one a couple weekends ago, and we had about 150 people show up, which was quite a jump from about 5 to 10 people, which was our average a couple years ago before we started doing these. So I think it's a very successful model to partner with the community and listen to what people have to say instead of just assuming you know what the solution is in order to empower people in the community. So with that, I'll conclude my portion of my talk, and I'll go ahead and hand it right back.
Tony, thank you so much. And I want to thank Sarah also, and Xavier, my whole team, for being willing to put up with me and do this. And I want to just go back and do a little bit just to conclude. We want to wrap things up a little bit, and then if there's any time at all for questions, we'll take them. I think it's important to start here. One of the things that I think it's important to think about is, what is this process about how we can actually begin to work at becoming an anti-racist, becoming better at the things we do. And I think one model that we can look at is exactly the Barrio model that Tony was talking about. It's surprising to both of us that when we started to compare notes, that we actually have very similar approaches to this in working in community. So I want to talk a little bit about how one can be welcoming in a racialized society. And this is basically talking about what Tony recommends. So think about Tony's model and then think about these ideas. Meet a community where it is. Learn about the community. Learn about what is part of it. Learn about who lives there. Learn about the leadership and the solutions that are already in place. Be of benefit to the community. There's a saying that was I think said in about 1975 from Lila Watson, who was an Aboriginal activist. She was very discouraged by people who came after years and years and decades and centuries of colonization. White people in Australia decided, we want to try and help. And they came and said, how can we be of help? What can we do? And it was discouraging because it's a burden to be having to lift up those who are trying to make amends for some of the wrongs that have been done in the past. So what she said is this. She said, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And if you think about process, that's a very simplified way of saying this is how we need to work together. Be supportive in the capacity you are invited to help. Be invited. And when you are, explain what you can bring. Acknowledge your place of privilege, whatever that might be. And we all have privilege. And when you're working with a community, we touched on this, always fairly compensate students, interpreters, BIPOC people, LGBTQ people, and anyone else who needs to be lifted up. Accommodate people's needs, accommodate people who are involved. When you get to know people, you know what is needed. You can answer that question for yourself. Ask yourself who should be making the decisions. Could you step aside? If there is someone else who's seated, who's there, who should be seated at the decision-making table, ask them to take your place. Power is shared. Shared power balances the leadership for every stakeholder community. Equity and inclusion means full, not token representation. Shared power balances participation in leadership. And so I want to end with just 2 quotes. Just to end, we have much work to do. The work is not done. The process is really before us for generations to undo racism in every community. Religious discrimination, gender discrimination, any kind of discrimination and trauma that you can think of. But what we need everywhere is a group of angelic troublemakers, as Bayard Ruskin said. And there is never a time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment, and the time is always now. James Baldwin. I'll leave you with that and say thank you for the opportunity to speak. We have
Thank you, Jen.
notes and things that are available to everyone, and
Yeah. I have one question that I posted here is addressed to the 4 of you. When activism can be easily equated to violence, how do we empower and transform people or communities? How do we process to bring about quality social engagement for development? And I would like to emphasize quality social engagement because in my own experience, it's easy to be socially involved by just simply I can write you a check. And then I can make myself feel good that I have been involved, I wrote a check, and then I go home and then stay in my own comfort zones. In what other way can we bring about consciousness, not only on the part of the privileged community, but also on the level of the underprivileged? How do we rise, or how do we raise their consciousness on both sides in order to be able to somehow meet in that middle ground where transformation can really happen, both in the individual, you know, we call this in Christian tradition they call it conversion, and in social parlance we say, you know, Sarah had mentioned so far, that is transformation.
that's a really interesting question. Would it be okay if I said something and then just pass it over to my cohorts? In upending racism, what I've started, and my belief system is that what the work we do is a process. It is not, it is an end in of itself. In other words, changing yourself means that you begin to be able to see opportunities that you didn't see. You begin to see harms that you didn't see if you have privilege, and you begin to find a new way to work. It takes a lot of practice, and you make a lot of mistakes in that process. So there's support, there's also accountability, and there's the understanding that change is going to start with yourself. Whether that be that you're working through feelings of oppression and trauma, or whether it be that you're being accountable to your own privilege, or in most cases with human beings, it's a combination of both. I'll pass it off at that point.
I can add a little bit to help clarify that question. I think it's super important to recognize that individual violence, speaking in relation to things like riots or protests that have been escalated by individuals, I think it's important to recognize that those are moments in which people's frustration boils over, and they have attacked symbols and systems and structures and buildings that have never been a benefit to them. So that's a little bit of context for the individuals, but I think I also wanted to share a little bit of my opinion about another kind of violence, and that's the structural violence, um, and the things that stop people from being able to engage in a system like politics or like our economy, um, and what are the barriers that stop people from engaging in other ways before they have to boil over and have a really genuine human reaction of violence as an individual. So those structures of violence are systemic racism, the places and uh, spaces in which individuals are systemically pushed out of the conversation, where Black women and yeah, actually, I want to speak specifically about Black women for a second. Um, I think a really important recognition is the times in which Black women have been used as medical props, in which their humanity was completely um, diminished, and um, genuine violence in every sense of anyone's mind can must be acknowledged. And I also want to acknowledge the violence that happens in our schools, in every school. Like I live in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I remember seeing, I want to say 2 to 1 security officers to guidance counselors. And I know that since I've left and I graduated 6 years ago, that they've escalated a police presence now and increased security. And I know that they don't have the kind of emotional support and therapy that individuals need. Um, yeah. Does anybody else want to share anything?
I want to say, add one more part to this too, in the terms of the getting together with process to heal. We have some rules. I love that shirt. We have some rules in upending racism, and they're pretty simple. One thing is that you listen with the intent to understand, and that listening is actually more important than speaking. So that's part of the behavior that we try to foster in our group. The second part is that when we speak with intention. And the third part is that we are able to understand that some discomfort is going to be necessary or probable, and that this change is kind of messy. So we hold people accountable for their presence in the group, and yet hold that together with respect and love.
Yeah, and
Hey, Jen. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I just say something real quick? Um, so I keep reading the question to kind of like fully understand what it is exactly that is being asked. And I guess this kind of reminds me of like the 4 energies of social change, or whatever you want to call it, in which you have helpers, rebels, advocates, and organizers. And I think that this question is kind of like addressing what happens when those 4 energies are thrown out of balance, right? Because we tend to think that one of those energies is more important than the others. So a lot of times, you know, in terms of activism, which is basically rebellion, because you're rebelling against an existing system and trying to say this needs to be changed for the better, we can see that as being equated to violence, because we don't, like you just said, we don't listen to people. And like Xavier said, then that spills over into like anger, and that's what escalates into violence. I think something that we have to keep in mind and make sure that we're always striving to do is allow those 4 energies to be in balance, and never think that one is necessarily more important than the other, because then people will naturally kind of flow through those different energies. Like at Barrio and SOP, we tend to be more advocate and organizing, or not even advocate, more like helper and organizing. oriented in terms of those energies. But that doesn't mean that I wouldn't go out to like a protest with, you know, with Xavier and Jennifer, to like bring awareness to a particular issue, or then like I'm doing tonight, advocating on behalf of using, you know, this Barrio model to then help to empower people, et cetera, et cetera. You have to make sure that these energies are in balance. And I think that activism being equated to violence is kind of what happens when you decide, okay, well, like, you know, this energy is not as important as another energy. And then that's what causes people to become frustrated, because then you don't see change that happens. So I just kind of want to like say that, because that's how I kind of interpreted this question. So sorry, Sarah, I know you wanted to say something.
No, thank you for the reframe. And I think like for Sunrise, like we often will fill the rebel or organizing or advocate role. And I just want to add for transformation that like happens through taking action, whether that's like coming to your neighbors and being a helper after they're flooded out by a tropical storm and replanting trees, like, or bringing aid, or also like taking action to what Jen was saying about discomfort and like leaning into that and taking like, yeah, transformation happening through action. And at Sunrise, like we do direct action, and there's different ways of doing that.
I think one other word that came to mind, Sarah and Tony and everyone, was authenticity. I mean, Tony really, I think, framed it really well, but I think if we act with authenticity, and if that's what we're trying to find again, because so much of our daily life is tied up in moving away from ourselves, we need to be in touch with who we are. And when we're present with ourselves, we then can act appropriately, whether it be helping or whether it be advocating or any of those things. I don't know if that helps, Caesar, if you think that maybe addressed
Yeah,
it.
yeah, very well. And but before we run out of time, I have also one question here that's been forwarded. Uh, are there models or solutions in place in communities which prompt change in our communities, inspiring things like restorative justice?
Yeah, I can just add that in the resources from this talk, I included a title of a book called Beyond Survival, and it's the last section of the title, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. And that book is full of those models happening around the country and world. And then maybe Xavier or Tony would want to speak to something locally, or Jen, but that switching from not just restorative justice that is interdependent and relational, but doesn't truly address the underlying causes of harm. Transformative justice goes beyond that to address those causes through deep relationship with people who have committed harm.
Thanks, Sarah. I think we're all going to go out and get that book. Anybody else? Could you restate the question, Caesar, just to keep us grounded? I don't know if he can. Oh, I think you're off.
Oh, sorry. Uh, Jay Fratto was asking, are there models or solutions in place in communities which prompt change in our communities, inspiring things like restorative justice?
I've heard quite a few even today, or I should say in this Congress. I think there are many groups that are already working on this. It's almost like we're at a watershed point in our society where many groups are really working hard to make change happen. I think that models have to be flexible. I think that they have to, I try to come in without a whole lot of preconceptions, because sometimes you need to be told, or you need to find out, you need to discover what will work in a certain situation.
That's a really good question. And I just wanted to say, like, you know, for example, like here in Reading, Barrio just recently started our own chapter here of the time bank model. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of time bank. And so basically, we're looking, so we have people volunteer through the time bank, in which they get paid time credits for every hour that they spend doing XYZ in the community, either volunteering for us, like throughout our cleanups or movie nights and stuff like that, or spending time, providing a service to their fellow community members. And so they're able to exchange that for an hour of something else, from another community member, whether it be like an oil change or maybe like a lesson in a particular instrument or something like that. And so something that we are looking to start is partnering up with one of the local magisterial district judges to get them involved with the time bank, so that we can have instead of people who like go through their court and have to do volunteer community service for like XYZ, whatever, we kind of route them through the time bank, have them, earn time credits that they can then use in, to get services from another community member, but also then get them involved with like Barrio and SOP, get them involved with neighborhood organizations in their community, so that basically we're able to route them into doing something positive for their community. So it's like a two-way street. They're doing something for the community, and the community does something for them. So that's one thing that I see us doing that kind of plugs into that idea of restorative justice. I know there's a whole range of things that restorative justice means, but I think that that's part of it.
Okay. Sarah, can you take that question from Carol for the last few minutes that we have?
Yeah, I'll try and keep this brief. So a question from Carol is, if the Berks Detention Center is closed and we win that campaign, won't the families be sent to another detention center, maybe in Texas? And this is something that we really hear a lot. And so I first want to say that I think this, this was also my first initial thought, but this, the Berks, like the Ship the Berks Coalition is immigrant led, and we, as a coalition, we don't know exactly what would happen. We don't have the governor and wouldn't have complete control, and neither would Berks. But we think, based off other situations, that it could be more likely that they would actually just be released back into the community. But there is the risk that they would be sent to Texas. But at the same time, we don't think that the conditions at Berks are actually that much better than Texas. Berks County, just a content warning trigger alert, I guess, but the Berks Detention Center is the only one in the country where there has been institutional rape against women detained. And I think that there's this concern among many of us who are white and want to be allies of well, isn't just it better conditions here? Don't we know best? And I think that we need to listen to what the immigrant rights led organizations are saying, which is that we need to close all the centers, and we have less control over those ones in Texas right now. So we can start with our publicly run center, and releasing them. Also, Berks is the only one that has ever held a license, and so there's some legal piece behind it as well, where if we shut down Berks, there's less of a legal support for the institution. And that said too, we also need to work to abolish ICE, and we can start to do that hopefully later this year to next year.
Thank you, Sarah.
And feel free to reach out too, Carol. I know that might not answer your question fully, so shoot me an email.
Yes, and then thank you all, Jan, Tony, and Xavier. Thank you for your presence and the knowledge you have shared. That's all the time we got. So thank you all, and have a good night and a pleasant evening.